I have one of these in my office. I don't know how many of you have one of these at home. They're weirdly expensive, but I bought one of these when I was a 2006 junior faculty member. And I had this like image in my head of a student coming into my office and saying something about the hippocampus, and me like wheeling around in my chair and getting this thing and kind of reverse origamiing out the hippocampus and being like, here is the seat of declarative memory. And I had this sort of sense, and I think the assumption is in these models and in the field as a whole built in, that if we just figure out what each of the bits do, then we'll have a complete understanding of the human mind, as if it's all sort of encapsulated in this thing. But it isn't like that because we didn't evolve this way, right? And it's not that we haven't learned a huge amount from studying brains in isolation. I do believe that visual cortex is back here, and that there are other parts of the brain that are really doing the things that people are sort of mapping out. Hey, Stefan. Sorry. But we can't get to a complete picture of the human brain until we really understand how this works. We don't live like this. We live in constant in and out interaction with other minds. We couple with other minds constantly. And when we don't couple with other minds, we get weird, right? And we will, in fact, risk our lives. Like COVID showed us that we will risk our lives to interact with each other. And it may not be a dumb idea, right? That in fact, it's like one of the leading causes of mortality is isolation. So it's kind of understandable why we are driven to be in interaction all the time. And we don't live like this. We live like spiders that have webs where they offload cognition into their webs. We think with other people. We think in our social webs, right? This is how we do science. Let's take them, these pictures, some of them were taken from Mind a few years ago. We're just constantly talking and brainstorming together and figuring things out. And that's what designing a study looks like, this completely networked enterprise of connecting other minds. And all of that stuff goes into designing a study that looks like typically people in a cubicle seeing something on a screen, right? Which is so not actually what we do. Not that we haven't learned from this, but what are we missing by not understanding how we really think? And like this is most psych studies, neuroscience didn't help matters because the technological constraints were like turning the cubicle 90 degrees and sliding it into a tube. You know, it doesn't actually help us understand interaction all that much. We're trying to work with the methodological constraints that we have, but it's clear that we've been missing a ton. This is actually a quote from a good friend of mine, David Popel, who he says, what is the parts list? That's the main question that you should ask as a neuroscientist, is what is the parts list? And I adore David, but I think he's wrong. I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think reducing to single parts at a time and looking things in isolation, and that you're going to get the emergent properties of this complex social interaction from trying to figure out a parts list. In fact, I encourage you guys to watch this series of lectures on complexity, the Complexity Explorer, which is the Santa Fe Institute. Does anybody know what SFI is or has been? It's a collection of researchers from physics and biology, but everybody's interested in complexity science, the complex domain. And what David Krakow, who's the president of SFI, talks about in this video actually, is that you can think of fields in terms of four sort of dimensions, that four kind of disciplinary traits that define those fields. How quantitative is it? How obsessed are people with measurement and calculation? How historicist, this just means that is the temporal dimension interesting? How things adapt over time. Reductionist, are you looking for a parts list? Are you going down levels to understand? If you're interested in electricity, you want to understand the electron, that would be a reductionist view. And there's compressive, And compression, or the compressive feature, is often confounded with reductionism, but is very different. And I think it's a really important thing to grasp. And that is, how amenable is what you're studying to sort of looking at it at looking for compressions of data without stripping things into sort of bare bones. So you're keeping all the complexity, all the richness of the data. So this is what we do when we do naturalistic studies. Take all the richness, and you're looking for statistical regularities, mathematical descriptions of that data, patterns in that data. And those are compressions of the richness without reducing this bit, this bit, this bit, this bit, right? And I think that that's where complexity science is historicist, compressive, and quantitative, but not reductionist. And I think that is something that we want to kind of embrace as a social interaction science. So this is quite a departure from the way many of us were trained. I'm probably the oldest in the room, by probably quite a lot, actually. Yes, okay, that's true. But I still think that Luke and maybe even Megan and Matt were trained in the way of strip everything, like control for everything except for the one little variable that you care about, right? Internal experimental control is king. Control everything. That's the reductionist piece. Look for the parts list. So this is a completely different idea. This is take everything, allow for covariation. As Luke says, embrace covariation. Things co-occur in nature. Allow it to exist. And then look for the mathematical descriptions of all of it together, because that's really what real life is. That's what the naturalistic approach is all about. Okay, I'm going to tell you about, I think, 3 studies, very, very briefly. I'm going to gloss over a lot because I want to kind of show you what I've been doing and what I've been thinking about, but then hopefully make a larger point. I'm going to start with this one. This is going back now to 2018. And it was the very first study I did that really made me think about interaction and what we're really missing as a field. And this was done when Carolyn Parkinson was a PhD student with me. She's now a professor at UCLA, and Adam Kleinbaum, who's still here, who's a professor at the Tuck School of Business. And our question was simply this: do friends think alike? Okay. So this is our social network. This is a social network. And we live in these things, these heaving social webs that are constantly changing. And like the spider's web, they help us think and remember and learn and create and all those sorts of things and build relationships. And there are a couple of interesting things about how people connect to each other in these webs, because connections don't form randomly. People connect in particular ways, and they connect based on roughly 2 major phenomena. One is homophily, which is the tendency of nodes to connect to others of the same type. Literally, love of the same is homophily. So people cluster together based on their similarity. And influence, which is the tendency of nodes to influence each other so that they become more similar over time. So homophily and influence really govern how people are connected with each other. I'm going to start with homophily. And this idea of homophily, even if you're not familiar with the term, goes back many, many years, millennia. This is birds of feather flock together, written in 15th century English. It's been this idea that people like to cluster along various dimensions, goes back a long time. And we've known about, in terms of demographics, that people cluster in age and gender, they start to dress alike, people who have the same musical taste, et cetera. So we wanted to study this and study whether or not it goes deeper than just pure demographics or superficial features, and whether actually people's brains are more similar, And because, as you know, we're here in the middle of nowhere where it's beautiful and there are no people. Luke's already made this point, I think, or didn't? Okay, yes. All right. Yeah, very few people. So when you find them, you know you have a social network, right? Because I would love to study Survivor, but this is because they're sort of shipwrecked on a desert island. But this is about as best you can get in a roughly civilized country. And even within Hanover, which is isolated, you have the Tuck School, which is even weirder isolated sort of thing, because they take classes together, they study together, they eat all their meals together, they live together, all in these interconnected buildings. And so they never have to even go outside. So it's like studying this encapsulated social network. And because it's part of their schoolwork, they have to answer this question. Consider the people with whom you like to spend your free time. Since you arrived at Dartmouth, who are the classmates you've been with most often for informal social activities, such as going out to lunch, dinner, drinks, etc. We're basically saying, this is what it means to be a friend, okay? And then we give them the entire roster of their cohort, 250 something students, and say, just check off who meets this definition, okay? And from that, we construct this big social network. The orange dots are the ones that we pulled out for our study. And in this cluster, you've got people who are one path length away. Those people are friends. And you've got people who are friends of friends. So they're not directly friends, but they've nominated someone that they have in common as a friend, and people who are friends of friends, and so forth. So we have all of this information available to us. And what we simply did is show people movie clips. I'm going to show you a little snippet of each of the clips, the much larger clips that we showed them. So you get a sense of the breadth of things that they saw while they're lying in an fMRI magnet.
When I was outside on my first spacewalk, I was on the dark side of the world, over the Indian Ocean.
And by having workers who only had to do one thing, they could pay them a low wage, and it was very easy to find someone to replace them.
The water squeezes out of the cloth, and then because of the surface tension of the water, it
is insulting when a coach is making 5 to 10 to 15 times more than a college president.
These babies are not strong enough to cling, and they fall to the ground repeatedly.
It's at times like that you don't often think of funny things to say, but I did. And I turned to the rescue workers and I said, talk about a rough day at work. That was referring to spending the time up there being pretty rough. Talk about a rough day at work.
Okay. There's all different kinds of humor. There's this sort of mockumentary, slapstick, music videos, all sorts of things. And we had people watch all these, and then we parcellated their brain, just carving it up into, I think this was 80 parcels. Now we do more, but this was just done with FreeSurfer at the time. And we then do something incredibly simple, which is just intersubject correlation for, does, superior parietal in this subject have the same bolt, similar bolts series to superior parietal and the next subject, and pairwise across our data set. Okay. And I'm just going to show you the top line result, which is that if you take, you can't read any of those. Those are the 80 regions. And if you just look at the pattern of similarity between people, what we see is that friends of friends of friends, so 3 path lengths removed, have relatively dissimilar brain activity, brain responses when they're watching these clips to each other. If you move 1 degree in the social network, friends of friends, they become more similar, and friends are remarkably similar, not in every brain area. There's some brain areas where it flips, but remarkably across these 80 regions, you get more similar neural responses between friends than people who are further removed. Now, this is cross-sectional data, right? So the big question is, did these people think alike from the start, or did they become more similar with shared experience? So to follow up on that, which is a paper actually that's under review at the moment, we took people right off when they came off the Dartmouth coach before they met each other at Tuck, and we stuffed them in a brain scanner and had them watch all those things. And then we waited several months for the social network to stabilize, so about 6 months. And then we could ask the question, does the similarity of their brain responses at time 1, before they've met each other, predict who becomes friends later on when they have time to get to know each other? And again, the top line of this is that, in fact, we can predict who becomes friends to some degree. We can really predict who does not become friends, which is interesting. So these people became 3 degrees friends out. They were dissimilar to the start, and they stayed out 3 degrees. These people became friends of friends, and these people became friends. Now, again, it's not, it's not like fully red, and although that's mostly blue, right? But it's the same pattern emergence. So there's something to be said for the fact that we befriend people who think like us, which is neural homophily, which is a bit, honestly, depressing, because we seem to gravitate towards people who already think like us. Now, of course, I think we already kind of knew that, but the question still remains, is there a role for getting together? Can we actually change our mind? Can we become slightly different people? And we think the answer of that is yes, and I'll get to a study in a second that looks at that question. But this again is just like one person in a magnet watching these things. So can you start to see this synchrony as it happens over time? And we are now starting to be able to see how two brains synchronize in real time. I think some of you are sort of doing this work. I heard hyperscanning come out in the introductions. So I'd love to talk to you more about this. I'm going to very, very briefly, because I don't even have a slide with the results. I'm just going to kind of tell you. We've been doing a little bit of hyperscanning. Actually, it's a project that's now in its 5th year. So, but we now have some results. And there's actually a Scientific American article that's already out about it, which is great, I guess. I don't know. But this is the study. We have people in 2 fMRI machines, and actually one lying downstairs at Dartmouth and one lying at Harvard. And they are connected over the internet. So they can hear each other and talk to each other in a normal volume. So that took 1.5 years to work out how to do that. And to deal with motion artifact, et cetera, et cetera. So just hand wave, assume that's all taken care of. The paradigm is that they're building a story together. So if you're lying in the scanner, you hear, and you can hear someone else you're connected to in another scanner. And you both actually get a prompt that says, a kid gets into trouble, is one of the prompts. And then it's your turn. You have 30 seconds to just start talking about a kid, make it up, anything. And you start talking, and there's a kid named Billy, and he comes across a stray dog, and you start talking for 30 seconds. And then there's a countdown that tells you when you're going to end, and it goes to the next person. They have to build on what you said, and then it comes back, and you start building the story, and you've got like, 15-20 minutes of like building this fantastical story together. There are control conditions in which you're building your own story, and you're interleaved, et cetera. But we're very interested in how when two minds come together and build something that never existed before, but is the product of their minds in interaction, what does that look like? And I'm going to give you a sense of what this sounds like. This is from one of the stories.
And they see where the spaceship just landed. They're really excited, but they're really nervous, and they're kind of hiding behind some bushes. And suddenly a door opens.
And outside the door, it's Michael Jackson. And I'm like, what? So one of the students is a huge Michael Jackson fan, so he just is overcome by joy and breaks cover and starts running towards Michael Jackson. But as soon as he gets close, the figure that he once thought was Michael Jackson suddenly shifts form and turns into...
It's a hamburger, right? I don't know. But you start to see how people are building these stories together, and they can get really, really fun and weird. But the point being that this is, I think, what conversation is all about in a way, is going to sort of weird and wonderful places you would never get to alone. You had this like experience of talking with a friend and like, why are we talking about this now? Like, how did we get here? You're just in this sort of road trip through thought space. And you're creating something completely different that never existed before, that is a product of two minds. And sometimes people are in sync. Most of the time, actually, I would say, listening to the stories, that people are sort of in sync. But it varies. This is a quote from that Scientific American article of Caitlin, who's a graduate student in my lab, who was paired. She was lying in the Harvard scanner, actually, and she was paired with Lori Loeb, who's a computer science professor here. And they really had a good time. I think the prompt here is that a group of friends run into aliens. So you have to roll with that. And says they set their story not in a park like ours, but in an unfamiliar landscape. The person writing this actually did the study as well. During one of her turns, Lee said, the trees the children were climbing on looked really weird. The ground was starting to rise. Then her turn cut off and Loeb picked the story up, saying it felt like the creature took a breath. It was exactly what Lee had been thinking, that the children were walking on the alien itself. It really felt like we're on the same page, Lee says. So one thing we're very interested in is when these things happen, when people just are so in tune with each other that they can pick up, and it's just like they're sharing a mind. What are the mathematical descriptors of what that looks like? What we are finding is that, and Chris, you can correct me if this doesn't sound right to you, but that intersubject correlation of just like, is this part of my brain doing the same as the same part of Chris's brain when we're doing this kind of collaborative exercise, is not really the best way to look at this. In fact, there are many more correlations that are spatially different across brains. So one part of my brain is correlated with another part of Chris's brain, and so forth. So intersubject functional connectivity may be one way to look at this, but we're in the very early stages of figuring out how to mathematically describe two brains in interaction. And if you guys have ideas, I would be all ears, because I think synchrony is just where we're starting. Okay. So I mentioned that this idea that people just kind of find each other and befriend each other and cluster together is certainly true. But it also must be the case that we adapt to each other. And that's neural influence, that we can become more similar to each other based on sharing experience. I think that is the kind of the purpose. One of the purposes of conversation is to align our minds together to make sure that we're sort of ticking along in the same way. And this was work done with Bo Sievers, who's now a postdoc at Stanford, and Uri Hassan, Kleinbaum, Chris, who's my graduate student right here. And this study has been under review for 2 years and 11 months, and it got accepted yesterday. So thank you, Nature Communications, for your speedy review system. Okay. In the study, people are lying in a scanner and they're seeing these ambiguous, there's some people doing work with ambiguous stimuli, which is really cool, and I want to talk to you guys. They're lying in a scanner and they're seeing these sort of ambiguous movie clips, and they're ambiguous because they're taken at parts of the movie where you don't really know the backstory. The sound is off, so you can't tell what people are saying. You just know that there's relationships involved, but you don't really know what's going on. And they're watching these things while they're lying in a scanner. I'm going to show you a 30-second clip from one of these things that they saw, just so you get a sense of the ambiguity, but you can tell people have certain kinds of relationships and you're trying to figure it out. Okay, here we go. All right, so who's the weird kid in the hallway? Why did he slump to his knees? Why does Nicole Kidman not care? Has anybody seen this movie? Right, so we try to pick movies that nobody had seen. Obviously that would it makes it less clear what's going on then. All right, so they're watching these things and they're trying to sort of make sense of it when they're watching it. And then we get them together with other people who've done this study. So everybody has seen these clips, and when each of them gets out of the scanner, they have to write down their own personal interpretations. Now they're together and they got to hash it out. And they got to come to a consensus. What was going on? Who was this kid? Any idea who the kid was in relation to Nicole Kidman? Oh, good. People came up with that one. Any others? Yes?
Ex's son.
The ex's son? No. Okay, it's Nicole Kidman's dead ex-husband reincarnated into a kid. Right. No one comes up with that. But all the groups come up with a different interpretation. Then they go, each of them individually goes back into the scanner and they see those video clips again. Now they can see them through the lens of the group, is sort of the idea, the lens of the group discussion. And importantly, these clips that they've already seen are followed by new clips from the same movies later on in the movie, same characters, but they haven't ever discussed them because they hadn't seen them before. And we created all these sort of change maps, which are like how similar are two people from a group after the discussion. So that now they're seeing those clips again, versus how similar they were before. Like, do people come into alignment? And the first result is simply that yes, they do. Conversation synchronizes brain activity within groups. And it did so with every group, but differently for each group. So there's no like synchrony area. There's no like alignment area. It depends on your conversation what comes into alignment, but each group had a different interpretation and a different kind of pattern of alignment, but all groups came into alignment. This is just grabbing one region just to show you what this sort of looks like. Everybody here is a different person in the group, different color, different person. Time series before conversation, and over again we see this sort of tightening of the signal after conversation. So they are starting to see these clips in the same way. And you can even look for the change in intersubject correlation and say, well, what's happening at these peaks when people go from roughly zero, some of these are zero correlations to 100% correlated. And those moments are actually the moments that are rated as being sort of pivotal to the scene, like, oh, I know now why he's falling to the floor. And we all have the same interpretation of that. And I think most importantly, we see this increased synchrony persist into the future for novel clips that were never discussed. So that's important because it suggests that people aren't overfitting on what they actually saw and discussed, but they're creating these sort of mental models, these frameworks for how to think about the characters more generally that then sort of bias how they see future behaviors from those same characters. So they're taking that knowledge from the group and it's extending into, they're carrying it with them into new information. But of course, we don't, from this study, we don't have a sense of, we don't actually scan this part of it. So what we see is sort of a trace of what we think is happening in the middle, but we do know where these people came from. So what I haven't told you is that we took these people from the Tuck network, so we know exactly who's friends with whom, and most importantly for this study, how central these people are in their network. Now, centrality is how well connected, eigenvector centrality anyway, is how well connected you are to well connected others, how influential you are in a network. That's very important for information flow in a network. And we could tell where each of these people sat. And so we could ask the question is, does eigenvector centrality, which again is this idea that the people who are most central, the most well connected, does that predict how people come into alignment? So you can imagine, I've told you that each group comes into alignment. They come closer together in how they think. But is that all even? Does everybody just come the same amount? Or do some people have more gravitational pull, right? And we thought, okay, maybe these highly central people in a network would have more gravitational pull on other people's brains. That they'd say, this is the right interpretation, you guys come to me. And that's how alignment would be achieved. That's what we predicted. We actually found the opposite, which I'll mention in a second. Highly central members did in fact create alignment more than anyone else. For every word they spoke, their groups came into alignment more, but they didn't do it by pulling everybody to them. So all my animations are off here, but so I'm just going to give you this slide. Here's how they did it. First of all, they didn't speak any more than other members. So they didn't do it through just a volume of words. They were not rated, interestingly, as the most influential by their group members or outside raters who watched the videos later. The groups went with who spoke the most. Outside raters went with who spoke the most. Those people seemed like the leaders and had most influence. But actually, if you look at the people who spoke the most, for every word they spoke, their groups came into less alignment. So the highly central members didn't do it by verbosity or dominating the conversation. How they did it was they directed attention to others and created equal turn taking. So highly central members pulled everyone together by creating equal turn taking. And in fact, they adapted their own brain activity to the group rather than pulling the group to them. This is a really interesting, I think, way of thinking about leadership and what it means to be central in a network. That you're creating sort of convergence, alignment, synchrony, but you're doing it in a way that is getting everybody else on the same page, not dominating and pulling people to you. Okay, these are all screwed up, so I'm just going to scroll. There we go. So this is just a cute video. It's actually by Uri, and he put all these metronomes on. They start at a different point in their cycle. He's putting them on these cylinders that allow them to provide movement feedback to each other, to talk to each other, if you will. Okay. So it's a little too cute by half, but I think that this is a pretty good metaphor for what conversation does. Certainly in our study, and granted, we were looking at how people come into alignment, how people come to consensus with each other. But I think what we do with each other, this interaction really does shape our brains so that we can become more like each other and stay tuned to the group. I think group living requires that. I think when we are not allowed to do that, we get off, our mental models drift, and we become less normative, and that's not great for us. So I think something that what conversation does for us is keep our brains optimized by coupling with each other and sort of rubbing off on each other. Okay, so what have we learned so far? Well, first, people befriend like-minded people, if you didn't know that already. But conversation also changes minds and aligns brains. High centrality people are good at aligning minds, and they do this in part by getting people to contribute equally and helping to find common ground. And synchrony is a useful measure of alignment. I think most of us in this room know this already. Synchrony, I think, is a pretty good compression of something that's happening in interaction. It's a useful way of describing what's going on. But is it the only measure? Oops, sorry, hang on a minute. Something's happening. This, okay. Sorry about that. Okay. And I've spent this part of the talk, and I've only got a little bit left to go, but this part of the talk sort of talking about synchrony and measuring synchrony, and synchrony predicts friendship and cohesion and alignment, all these good things. But can you think of a situation or some time that you might not want to synchronize, or you might want to break synchrony? Mobs. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Contagion, mobs, cults. Huh? Yes. Science. Yeah. I mean, coming together and thinking the exact same way is not all good, right? I mean, think about if art was like that, you know, or we have to oftentimes break patterns, even in our own labs, of how we think about things. So I think there are definitely times when we want less synchrony. So how do we do it? There are all sorts of ways, but how do we do it in conversation so that we can innovate and conversation can evolve? So one thing I want you to do right now, this is slightly weird, is turn to your neighbor and look them in the eyes. Don't talk, just stare into their eyes for just a few seconds. Don't talk. Okay, all right. Some of you are already broken out of it. Fine, it's fine. It's weird, right? It's incredibly intense. This behavior that we do all the time in conversation is very intense. So we can only do it for like seconds at a time. But weirdly enough, we do it all the time. About 50% of conversation is spent making eye contact. We just kind of look, it's like they're mostly like a second long, like look away, look like that. We're doing it all the time. The question is why? That's a big mystery. We do know that conversations that have more eye contact tend to be more engaging, enjoyed more. So that's interesting. But it's not like we're worried the other person's gone away, right? Like, why do we have to stare at them? So we wondered, what is this eye contact doing? Is it helping us to create synchrony? One thought would be, you notice someone's mind is sort of drifting away, and so you stare at them to kind of like a taser or something, bring them back. That's sort of in the literature, the finding that there's more eye contact and more engaging conversations. People tend to think, okay, eye contact helps you create this kind of synchrony. So we looked into it. Well, Sophie, who was my graduate student, who's now a postdoc at University of Wisconsin, looked into it. And what she found was really interesting, and I want you to keep in mind in terms of synchrony. So what she found was that in conversation, there are these moments where pupillary synchrony increases, and when it gets really high, so pupillary synchrony, for those that you don't know, is just dilations, your pupil dilations. And something we found and many others have found now is that when you are sharing attention with somebody, your pupil dilations synchronize. So pupils dilate when you're in a dark room, and when you're in a light room, they shrink, right? We all know that light reflex. If you keep the light constant, pupils are constantly constricting and whatever the opposite of constricting is, I can't think. Dilating, thank you. All the time. And that's based on what you're attending to and your levels of arousal. And so it makes sense, stands to reason that when you're sharing attention with somebody else, your pupils are dilating in the same way over time. Okay. So what she found was you're in conversation, your pupils start dilating in sync with someone else more and more and more and more and more, and that gets to be really high. And at that moment, you make eye contact. That's the moment you make eye contact, when synchrony is really high. And then it just tanks. Synchrony just drops off a cliff when you do that, and it goes down and down and down as long as you make eye contact. So if you make eye contact for 8 seconds, it's tanking for 8 seconds. If you make eye contact for 1 second, it tanks for 1 second. And as soon as you break eye contact, synchrony starts to recover. So it seems like, yes, it is true that the most synchronous conversations, the most engaging conversations have more eye contact, but eye contact, rather than creating this synchrony, seems to be a corrective of too much. And this suggests, right, that maybe synchrony all the time is not good, that we want to break it, maybe to get new thoughts into the mix. So you can imagine if synchrony is about shared thought, and you can think about a conversation being a co-creative act, that you can't just think the same thing all the time. You have to fuel it with something new, right? And so there might be a rhythm of coupling and decoupling that's really important. So maybe not, more synchrony is always better, but maybe there's something more, a little bit complicated going on. And I think this makes sense because conversation is not a passive act, right? You may, I don't know, see some of this work, but many of you do NLP kinds of things. So if you take just a transcript of a conversation, I just got out of philosophy class. What is it? Philosophy, what? Moral philosophy. Seems like a terrible class. Where's Jonathan? Is he in here? Okay. It's so bad. I hate it so much. It's okay. I just feel like you get some really crazy people. Right? This is a conversation. This is just normal, just casual conversation. And what you can do with big language models, right, is you can take each of these turns and you can drop them into it and get a node in the space. This is the use model, which is, I think, 512 dimensions, something like that. So you can get a node where that lives in the space, the semantic space of language, and you can just repeat, right? Get the next node, get the next node, get the next node, and then you've got a conversation that you can plot. This is on 2 dimensionals, which obviously has many, many distortions, but just so you can sort of see it, this is what a conversation looks like if you plot it in U space collapsed into 2 dimensions, where the red dots are where people start and the violet dots are where people end. Shorter speech turns are smaller and larger speech turns are bigger. And conversations are these beautiful things that just travel all over the place. And the trajectories vary. So some conversations look like this and others like that. Some people like to pop around a lot, and other people like to just go deep on one topic, and they're beautiful. They're all conversations are completely unique. You can never have the same conversation twice. It's a completely creative act. It requires both sharing attention and fueling the conversation with independent insights. So this dynamic back and forth is what Interacting Minds is all about, and I think is what we need to do as a species. So this can't be sort of recovered perfectly in just time-locked synchrony, right? It's a rhythmic kind of coupling, uncoupling, and all sorts of interesting dynamics are going on. But if you only look at one brain at a time, you'll never see it, right? It's a dynamic dance between 2 or more people. And it's what we know very little to nothing about. So we know somewhat about the individual mind, and we know some stuff about the collective sort of hive social network stuff, but we don't know this middle piece that actually is the thing, right? This is the stuff that makes that, and this is the stuff that makes that. But this is the thing that we aren't studying and we don't know anything about. And that's kind of crazy. And that's what I think these next couple of weeks are really about, is for you guys to dig into how do we start to study this as a field? How do we start to study this because that's where the magic is happening. And that's it. Welcome to Mind, interacting minds.
Time for questions.
Yeah, really great talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering, so you were saying synchrony might not be the best way to analyze neural data, but in synchrony, do you have an idea of what an alternative would be rather than looking at synchrony?
I mean,
predicted, like a
yeah,
within time prediction or something?
We've been analyzing this data set, the hyperscaling data set, for 5 years. And we're doing, and the first paper will be synchrony, well, intersubject functional connectivity, but it's synchrony 2.0 or whatever. But what we hope the paper after that will be is something where we're doing something a bit more sophisticated. But the tools in social neuroscience are very limited. So we're trying to import from neighboring sort of fields, but things like dynamical systems approaches, information theoretic approaches like transfer entropy. So how does my brain state at time 1 predict your brain state at time 2? These sorts of things are going to be, I think, much better at kind of capturing this. But this is the wild, wild west, right? And I would give anything to be sitting where you guys are instead of being up here. Like, I'm 52 and this is like just cracking open, right? We are just, I mean, I might have, knock on wood. Is there any wood in this? Is this wood?
Nothing is wood.
Hopefully I have like 20 more good years, I don't know, of mental capacity to help investigate these questions, but you guys have a lot more, and I'm jealous of that, because I think, yeah, we're going to look back on this and be like, remember when people were just like, time lock synchrony? I mean, that's where we are as a field, and there's no shame in it, because I think actually synchrony is a good compression of lots of things going on, but there's so much more out there. I mean, conversation, it's not a line dance, right? It's a coordinated, beautiful thing. I mean, not the line dances. I know if you like line dances, that's great. But it's this nuanced, coordinated dance that's much more complex than that. Yes.
Yeah. So first of all, I love these studies and love these questions. Super cool stuff. I think your point about kind of there might be kind of you don't want perfect synchrony because then you're kind of talking to a mirror, so it's not interesting. Like, why would you want to clone your brain and talk to that? And then if your brain is like totally misaligned with someone, maybe there's no communication possible. Yeah. So maybe there's this sweet spot in the middle where you want to reach it. But I'm trying to think about it as like maybe an optimization problem. And I'm just curious, like, what you think might be optimized there. Is it like amount of information you can transfer, or like influenceability, or I don't know, like, how are you thinking about that?
And I think I know some of you are studying individual differences. I think people are tuned in different ways to this. I think some people are really about maximizing learning new things and don't want to be with people that think just like them, right? I think those people are rarer than the other kind. But yeah, are people, well, it depends what people are, why people are interacting. Are they about learning new things and kind of trying to get out of their comfort zone and push themselves into new ideas? I think a lot of us are like that. And a lot of people in science are like that. But other people just want to just hunker down with their friend and just kind of have a good time. And, it's not about learning new things. It's about, can we dance together the old dance we've always done? There's lots of ways to sort of address that question, but I don't think the field has really looked at it yet.
Cool.
Stefan.
I love the all of this, but the stuff I'm not familiar with is the stuff you put at the end, pupillary symphony. And I'm just trying to think of how to think about that, because in real life, or for all of evolution, when you want to have a conversation with someone, you got to be there with them, basically doing the eye contact, onset and offset to get that symphony changed. Now we don't have to do that. We have Zoom, which is highly unnatural, where you can't do eye contact at all.
Right.
And we have audio calls where there's no eyes involved at all. So how does the pupillary synchrony stuff fit into like conversation in these kinds of situations?
It's still going. So we've done studies where you can't see each other and you still get synchrony. It's just a signal of what you're attending to. So as long as you're attending to the same words that you're hearing, you're going to get the synchrony. It's not mimicry, for example, right? We can't control our pupil dilations. We aren't mimicking someone else. We are, in fact, just sharing a stream of attention. And by virtue of that, we get these pupillary dilation synchrony. So it can happen in Zoom and phone calls, et cetera. The eye contact thing is interesting though. I mean, it's why I never like talking on the phone, and I don't like Zoom either, right? Because you can't quite gauge when to pass the baton. And I think eye contact was really helpful with that, and Zoom is pretty bad at it.
Yeah, so I was just thinking that might be a way to show that, right? Like this may be a reason why you don't like.
Yes. Yeah, I thought Zoom would get better at fixing the eye contact thing. I don't think it's a intractable problem, but yeah, it's not. But yeah, it's a great medium in some ways too. I think you can still have affecting conversations on Zoom, but you have to learn how to deal with the technological things that are getting in the way of something we do so naturally and effortlessly. And it's why I think, I don't know how many of you did this. I was doing like cocktail hour with my friends at the beginning of COVID. We would get on Zoom and all have a martini or something, and those just fell off. Like, who wants to do that? No one wants to do that in the end, right? I know you're my best friend, but I just don't want to have a drink on Zoom. Like, it's just a chore. So yeah, the technology gets in the way there. Yeah.
I have two questions, if that's okay. So for the conversations, it struck me that the types of conversations where we're having an fMRI scan are really kind of collaborative. There's a goal of generating this single mind. But what do you think would happen for conversations, like for example, job interviews? So there is some kind of a boundary there. Do you think, I mean, I guess you could expect that to be less synchrony, but then could that also be predictive of, how well the person does? But I guess more generally, the question is, what is the kind of range of conversations that you think would be useful to test in these paradigms?
Oh, all of them. Yeah, I mean, we've only Emma Templeton, who sadly isn't here, but she does a lot of casual conversations between strangers and between friends. But there are all sorts of other kinds of conversations where we're trying to get somewhere, you were trying to brainstorm things, job interviews where it's very constrained and rigid. We're doing a study with between patients and doctors who patients just got diagnosed with end-stage cancer, and they're having to talk about the end of their life with their doctor. Like, so that's a much heavier kind of conversation than the kind of two college students, chatting. But I think there are all sorts of arguments, therapy, couples. I think all of it is important to all of us. And so we need to understand, we're just scratching the surface on every dimension, right? In terms of like, what kinds of conversation, there's so much to do, what kinds of methods to use, what kinds of conversations, studying different cultures. Cara Sanchez, who's here, studies conversations that friends have, that are their interracial interactions about race. all of it. We need to study deep conversations, shallow conversations, different arguments, consensus, brainstorming, all of it.
And do you find that synchrony tracks the outcomes of those conversations in different ways? Or?
I think that synchrony, I'm comfortable saying that synchrony is a marker of people feeling like they're on the same page and sharing mental models. And, but there's a lot more going on that we haven't even been really looking for.
Cool. And then the second, if I may, is so for these central people in networks that
Yes.
are good at directing attention, how much is this contingent on having formed that central network? Like, could you take those same people, put them in a group of strangers, and they're able to do the same thing, or does it
That's a
really
great
come down-
question. My intuition is they would, it's a set of, it's a portfolio of behaviors that they have and that they carry around with them. That they get people to sort of open up, and they make sure everybody's heard and that kind of thing, and that would translate to new environments, but we haven't studied it, but that's a great question. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I can read to the first question. So I just talked about the concept of synchronization in the like mind. So is that just a byproduct or a causal relationship between these two things?
Sorry, what is the
synchronization? You
Yeah.
just found some synchronization during the interacting months, but is the synchronization is causally produce represent the interacting minds in the brain, or just that of
What a beautiful question. I have no idea. We just are looking. Is the question whether, or maybe I'm not seeing the question. Is the question that is when two minds are in sync that they are able then to share representation, or is it just the activation of the representations time that if they're time locked are going to produce synchrony?
Yeah, it's I mean, what's so you didn't you didn't integrate the synchronized. If you integrate the synchronized, how the interaction will be disrupted or not? Yeah, or when you interact with others, that synchronized comes up. Because
maybe you're asking, is the synchrony like causally responsible for or the downstream consequence of people sharing mental models?
Yes. Don't know. We don't have, we're just looking at it in some very coarse ways of overall, are two people more synchronous in conditions where they are building like a story together versus when they're just by listening to each other. But if there are ways, if you can think of ways to get the temporal question, I mean, we could do a lagged approach potentially. But I don't know how to get at that question with our data, but maybe there's a different study that could get at that question. It would be challenging to do, but I think really cool if you could figure out how to do it. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have thought about kind of methods wise about what you think the next steps would be, and especially if you think that kind of neural metrics like synchrony or whatever comes next is kind of really the instrumental kind of variable to look into to understand the mind, or if there is also more sort of I don't know, new methods that we need to develop based just on kind of behavioral measures, or like understanding the mechanism behind the conversation without necessarily looking into the brain.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
converging to.
yeah, and I actually think there's easier and potentially richer ways to look at this that don't involve, this is a, mind, the N is neuroscience. So I wanted to skew heavily in neuroscience, but we are doing all sorts of NLP kind of work, social network analysis, behavioral studies, that I think are certainly easier and maybe even better and richer than where we are with neuroscience right now. I still am committed to wanting to see brains dancing together in real time and figuring out how to capture that, because it's not being captured by the methods that we're doing, really. I mean, synchrony a bit, but there's a much more complicated, beautiful dance going on. And so I'm very interested in figuring out how to develop new mathematical tools to capture that. But I think there's so much to be done in the behavioral space and the language space. I mean, Jeremy's doing that work and looking at networks of how people move around in semantic space together that is, I think, more tractable and can get us answers faster than hyperscanning. Although I encourage all of you to do hyperscanning. We'll get there. Paxton.
I'm really curious about this, like the drop off in synchrony after eye contact.
Yeah.
A little bit like speculative question, but I can imagine social scenarios where, I would kind of expect like maybe eye contact to decrease synchrony, like you're talking with a near stranger and you both kind of make eye contact and it's a little awkward and you both look away. But I can imagine like other scenarios where you're in a group of people and you and somebody says something and you and one other person kind of quickly look at each other and make eye contact because you both know what you're thinking and share some reference to what the person said. And I would think that kind of both like requires and promotes the synchrony. So
sure. I think that's a great example. It reminds me of The Office, the sort of look to the camera, like, are you seeing this? And two thoughts. One is, I don't know whether in that case, I think if there's decoupling, it's maybe decoupling from what's happening in the room at that moment and in the service of coupling with someone else. And those dynamics would be amazing to investigate. What was my other thought about this? I think you're right that those sort of glances are, that kind of say, I have the same shared mental model as you. I know what you're thinking at this moment, and it's what I'm thinking. And those are lovely, right? Emma Templeton actually is writing a paper now on insider language, this idea that that when you develop relationships, language goes inside the head. You don't have to spell everything out. You can have these coded words that unfurl all sorts of things in the other person's head. And this idea that we're sharing a mental model, I don't have to say every single word. I don't have to explain everything because I know you get me. And I know that we've had this shared, that's just a beautiful, rewarding thing, right? So I love that. I love that sort of set of ideas. And I think you're right that we use eye contact in some ways to say, we're sharing this, right? But we see this the same way. So I don't know what that would look in terms of pupil dilations or neural synchrony, but that would be a great question. Yes.
Sorry, if you allow me to pile on to that.
Sure. Yeah, go.
That was really also in my mind. I was wondering, even if you're in the same sort of just a dialogue conversation and doing eye contact as people, could you also interpret your results as eye contact as a wrapping of all of these processes for which synchrony is required? So we're both trying to track all of these things that we're saying, and that's the one moment where we're just grounding everything that's happening, and we don't need to do this anymore.
Yeah, that's an alternative explanation I think is just as valid as what we suggest in the paper, that it's almost like a it could be a we got this, and then we don't need it anymore, or it could be like, let's chunk this, and then whatever is happening with the synchrony going away is some process of sort of chunking that, but it's a kind of a positive, let's keep this in memory or something like that. And we don't know what that is. It's interesting that it then drops off. I don't really know what's happening in the drop off. We do know, we have another study that we just finished where we find that when people are listening to a story, when they hear something surprising, they'll be synchronized with the storyteller. The pupils of the storyteller and the listener will be synchronized, so they're sharing attention. And then the storyteller will say something surprising, the listener will decouple, will stop synchronizing. And the degree to which they decouple and the length of time to which they decouple predicts their memory for what was said. So it's like the speaker says something surprising, and you go, oh, I have to update my mental model. You go into your head, so you decouple to do that internal work, and that helps memory. And then they come back online, right? So there is this kind of rhythm of chunking things and decoupling in order to couple later.
Maybe one last question.
Great.
Also going off of.
Oh, good.
That's, I think it's really interesting. So this kind of made me think of some individuals on the autism spectrum when they're having conversations have a lot of difficulty.
Yes.
They don't actually make eye contact, right? So some behavioral therapies that focus on social behavior tell them to make eye contact. Some of them might even have something like, "Go watch the buzzes in the middle of conversation to remind you to make eye contact." But if eye contact tends to happen at this really specific point, potentially related to the synchrony of the conversation, could having them randomly make this eye contact actually interfere with their ability to have synchrony with the other individual? And should we maybe not be doing that as a therapy, or this is.
I think it comes from a well-intentioned place that you want people to look more normative or something. But I think, because eye contact is intense, and it's particularly intense actually for people on the spectrum, that it is that sort of taser in them, and it's disrupting what's naturally happening, which is they're not looking at you, but they're paying attention. Right. And so you make them do eye contact, and that's all screwed up. And it's something, neurotypicals make a lot of eye contact, but if someone was forcing you to make eye contact at particular times, it would screw all sorts of things up. Right. Not that we've looked at this, but this would be the idea that it would not be a great idea.
We could have something that would be able to track synchrony in conversation that the device listen to tell you the right point to make.
Yes. Oh, that's a lovely idea. That is a wonderful idea. Yes.
Hi, Alon, you just did that experimentally, right? So
yes,
eye contact happens at the time of synchrony is maximized. You could force people to have eye contact at random times.
Yeah, and
to the conversation.
Would people sign up for that study? That's great.
All right. Well, thanks, Thalia.